Fellow Earthlings, fellow people in Michigan, I found this article on The Atlantic. It's dated June 23rd, 2023. So, by David Brooks, illustrations by Vritka Sharma. You can find you are able to find the audio version of it on there. It's a 37 minute and 8 second audio clip. So more power to you if you want to go and look it up on there yourself. However, I'm going to read it here on YouTube. In October of 1858, John Stuart Mill and his wife Harriet were traveling near Avignon, France. She developed a cough which seemed just a minor inconvenience until it got worse. Soon Harriet was racked with pain, not able to sleep or even lie down. Mill frantically wrote to a doctor in Nice begging him to come see her. 3 days later, her condition had worsened further, and Mill telegraphed his forbiddings to his stepdaughter. Harriet died in the hotel room on November 3rd. Mill sat alone with her body in the room for a day. He was despondent over the loss of his marriage. For 7.5 years, that blessing was mine. For 7.5 years only. Later that same month, he sent a manuscript to his publisher, which opened with a lavish dedication to Harriet. He subsequently wrote that she had been more than his muse. She had been his co-author. The book was, he said, more directly and literally our joint production than anything else which bears my name. For there was not a sentence of it that was not several times gone through by us together. The book's whole mode of thinking, he continued, was empathetically hers. The book was called Our Liberty, or On Liberty. It is one of the founding documents of our liberal world order. Individuals, the Mills argued, have the right to be the architect of their own life, to choose whom to marry, where to live, what to believe, what to say. The state has no right to impinge on a citizen's individual freedom of choice, provided that that person isn't harming anyone else. A society organized along these lines, the Mills hoped, would produce a rich variety of creative, daring individuals. You wouldn't have to agree with my mode of life, and I wouldn't have to agree with yours. But we would give each other the space to live our fullest life. Individual autonomy and freedom of choice would be the rocks upon which we built flourishing nations. The liberalism that Mills championed is what we enjoy today as we walk down the street and greet a variety of social types. It's what we enjoy when we get on the internet and throw ourselves into a messy clash of ideas. It is this liberalism that we defend when we back the Ukrainians in the fight against Russian tyranny, when we stand up to the authoritarians on the right and the left, to those who would impose speech codes, ban books, and subvert elections. After he sent in the manuscript, Mill bought a house overlooking the cemetery where Harriet was buried, filled with the furniture from the room in which she died, and visited every year for the rest of his life. It's a sad scene to imagine him gazing down at her grave from the window. But the couple left us an intellectual legacy that has guided humanity another step forward in civilization's advance. Many good ideas turn bad when taken to their extreme, and that's true of liberalism. The freedom of choice that liberals create can be turned into a rigid free market ideology that enables the rich to concentrate economic power while the vulnerable are abandoned. The wild and creative modes of self-expression that liberals adore can turn into a narcissistic culture in which people worship themselves and neglect their neighbors. These versions of liberalism provoke people to become anti-liberal, to argue that liberalism itself is spiritually empty and too individualistic. They contend that it leads to a social breakdown and undermines what is sacred about life. We find ourselves surrounded by such anti-liberals today. I'd like to walk with you through one battlefield in our current crisis of liberalism, to an extreme version of itself, and now we might recover a better, more humane liberalism, something closer to what Mills had in mind in the first place. In 2016, the Canadian government legalized medical assistance in dying. The program called MAID was found on good million grounds. The Canadian Supreme Court concluded that laws preventing assisted suicide stifled individual rights. If people have the right to be the architect of their life, shouldn't they have the right to control their death? Shouldn't they have the right to spare themselves needless suffering and indignity at the end of life? As originally conceived, the MAID program was responsibly well defined. Doctors and nurses would give lethal injections or fatal medications only to patients who met certain criteria, including all of the following. The patients had a serious illness or disability. The patient was in an advanced state of decline that could not be reversed. The patient was experiencing unbearable physical or mental suffering. The patient was at the point where natural death had become reasonably foreseeable. To critics who worried that before long people who were depressed, stressed, or just poor and overwhelmed would be provided assistance to die, authorities were reassuring the new law wouldn't endanger those who are psychologically vulnerable and not near death. Citing studies from jurisdictions elsewhere in the world with similar laws, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau declared that this simply isn't something that ends up happening. But the program has worked out rather differently. Before long, the range who qualifies for assisted suicide was expanded in 2021. The criterion for that natural death must be foreseeably or reasonably foreseeable was lifted. A steady stream of stories began to appear in the media describing how the state was granting access to assisted suicide to people who arguably didn't fit the original criteria. For example, the Associated Press reported on the case of Alan Nichols. Nichols had lost his hearing in childhood and had suffered a stroke, but for the most part, he was able to live independently. In 2019, at age 61, he was hospitalized out of concern that he might be suicidal. Might be. He argued his brother Gary to bust him out of the facility as soon as possible. But within a month, he applied for a physician-assisted death, citing hearing loss as his only medical condition. The nurse practitioner also described Nichols' vision loss, frailty, history of seizures, and general failure to thrive. The hospital told the AP that his request for a lethal injection was valid, and his life was ended. Alan was basically put to death, his brother told the AP. In the New Atlantis, Alexander Rakin described the case of Rosanna Camus, who had fibromyalgia and chronic leukemia along with other mental and physical illnesses. She presented these symptoms to the MAID assessors, and her death was approved. Meanwhile, she wrote in a note, evidently meant for those whom she had granted power of attorney, please keep all this secret while I'm still alive, because I'm suffering. I experience is mental suffering, not physical. I think if more people cared about me, I might be able to handle the suffering, because by my physical illness alone, she was put to death on September 26, 2021 via a lethal injection at the age of 41. In the Free Press, Rupa Supramanian reported on the case of a 23-year-old man named Keanu Vafian, who was depressed and unemployed and also had diabetes and lost vision in one eye. His death was approved and scheduled for September 22nd, 2022. The doctor who was to perform the procedure emailed Vafian clear and antiseptic instructions. Please arrive at 8:30. I will ask for the nurse at 8:45, and I will start the procedure at around 9 a.m. Procedure will be completed a few minutes after it starts. The Vafian could bring a dog with him as long as someone would be present to take care of it. About 2 weeks before the appointment, Vafian's 46-year-old mother, Margaret Marcilla, telephoned the doctor who was scheduled to kill her son. She recorded the call and shared it with the Free Press, posing as a woman named Joanne. She told the doctor that she wanted to die by Christmas, reciting basic MAID criteria. The doctor told her that she needed to be over 18, have an insurance card, and be experiencing suffering that cannot be remediated or treated in some way that's acceptable to you. The doctor said he could conduct his assessment via Zoom or WhatsApp. Marcilla posted on social media about the situation. Eventually, the doctor texted Marcilla saying that he would not follow through with her son's death. Personally, I don't have great moral qualms about assisted suicide for people who are suffering intensely in the face of imminent death. These cases are horrible for individuals and families. What's important here is that the MAID program has spilled beyond its original bounds so quickly. When people who were suffering applied to the MAID program and said, "I choose to die," Canadian society apparently had no shared set of morals that would justify saying no. If individual autonomy is the biggest value, then when somebody comes to you and declares, "It's my body, I can do what I want with it," whether they are near death or not, painfully ill or not, it doesn't really matter. Autonomy rules. Within a few years, Canada went from being a country that had banned assisted suicide to being one of the loosest regimes in the world. Within just a few years, the number of Canadians dying by physician-assisted suicide ballooned, the overwhelming majority of them by lethal injection. In 2021, that figure was more than 10,000. 1 in 30 of all Canadian deaths, the great majority of people dying this way, were elderly and near death. But those who seek assisted suicide tend to get it. In 2021, only 4% of those who filed written applications were deemed eligible. If autonomy is our highest value, these trends are not tragic, they're welcome. Death is no longer the involuntary, degrading end of life. It can be a glorious act of self-expression. In the late 2022, the Canadian fashion retailer Lamassian Simons released a branding video that paid tribute to the assisted suicide of a 37-year-old woman afflicted with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which affects the body's connective tissue. The video, titled "All is Beauty," is released the day after the woman's death in a series of lush images of her on tourist destination beaches and at a dinner party. The video portrayed her death as the most beautiful exit, a sort of rich Instagram-ready consumer experience that you might get from a 5-star resort. Back in 2006, critics of the MAID law saw this coming. They warned that soon enough, people in anguish and near death wouldn't be the only ones given assistance to die. That warning turned out to be understated. Within a few years, Canada went from being a country that had banned assisted suicide to being one of the loosest regimes in the world. Some people leading pathos-filled lives have begun to see assisted suicide as a release from their misery. Michael Frazier, though not terminally ill at age 55, had become unable to walk and suffered from an array of medical problems, liver disease and incontinence, as well as mental health issues, after he described as prolonged sexual abuse as a child. His monthly check from the Ontario Disability Support Program was barely enough to live on. Some of the struggles he talked about was this feeling of not being worthy. The doctor who gave Frazier the lethal injection on July 2nd, 2022, told the Toronto Star, "There's a social aspect to poverty, a hierarchy that affected the psyche. He told me that it did." The assisted suicide had become an established part of the Canadian society. The complex moral issues surrounding the end of life have drifted out of sight. Decisions tend to be made within the bureaucratic context, where utilitarian considerations can come to dominate the foreground, or as the president of the Quebec College of Physicians, which regulates medical practices in the province, assisted suicide is not a political or moral or religious issue. It is a medical issue. A materialist cost-benefit analysis for some people crowds out affirmations that life is sacred and socioeconomic burdens weigh heavily in the balance. Tyler Dunlop is a physical healthy 37-year-old man who suffers from schizoaffective disorder and PTSD and has no job or home or social contact. When I read about medically assisted dying, he told a local news website earlier this year, "I thought, well, and logistically, I really don't have a future, knowing that I am not going anywhere," as he put it. He has started the process for approval under MAID. The New Atlantis published slides from the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers seminar, in which a retired care coordinator noted that a couple of patients had cited poverty or housing uncertainty rather than their medical condition as their main reason for seeking death. Healthcare costs also sometimes come into play. According to the Associated Press, Roger Foley, a patient at a hospital in Ontario, who has degenerative brain disorder, was disturbed enough by how often the staff talked about assisted dying that he began recording their conversations. The hospital's director of ethics informed Foley that if he were to stay in the hospital, it would cost Foley north of $1,500 a day. Foley replied that he had felt that he was being coerced into death. "Roger is not my show." The ethicists replied, "I told you my piece of this was to talk to you about if you had an interest in assisted dying." The hospital network told The Atlantic that it could not comment on specific patients for privacy reasons, and added that its healthcare teams do not discuss assisted dying unless patients expressed interest in it. These trends have not shocked. Oh, I was about to get the door for you. These trends have not shocked Canadian lawmakers into tightening the controls on who gets approved for MAID, or dramatically ramping up programs that would provide medical and community-based help for patients whose depression might be addressed in other ways. On the contrary, eligibility may expand soon. On February 15th, a parliamentary committee released a set of recommendations that would further broaden MAID eligibility, including to mature minors whose death is reasonably foreseeable. The influential activist group Dying with Dignity Canada recommends that mature minors be defined as at least 12 years of age and capable of making decisions with respect to their health. Canada is scheduled to move in a 2024 to officially extend MAID eligibility to those those only illnesses as a mental disorder. The frame of debate is shifting. The core question is no longer should the state help those who are suffering at the end of life. The lines between assisted suicide for medical reasons, as defined by the original MAID criteria, and straight up suicide are blurring. The moral quandary is essentially this: if you see someone rushing towards a bridge and planning to jump off, should you try to stop them, or should you figure that plunging into the water is their decision to make and give them the helpful shove? I don't mean to pick on Canada and the land of my birth. Lord knows that in many ways Canada has a much healthier social and political culture, less bitter and contentious than the United States does. I'm using the devolution of the MAID program to illustrate the key feature of modern liberalism, namely that it comes in different flavors. The flavor that is embedded in the MAID program is prevalent across Western societies, is what you might call autonomy-based liberalism. Autonomy-based liberalism starts with one core conviction: I possess myself. I am a piece of property that I own. Because I possess property rights to myself, I can dispose of my property as I see fit. My life is a project that I am creating, and nobody else has a right to tell me how to build or dispose of my own life. The purpose of my life in this version of liberalism is to be happy, to live a life in which my pleasures, however I define them, exceed my pains. If I determine that suffering outweighs my joys and that things will never get better, then my life isn't working. I have a right to end it, and the state has no right to prevent me from doing so. Indeed, it ought to enable my right to end my life with dignity. If you start with autonomy-based liberalism, MAID is where you wind up. But there is another version of liberalism. Let's call it gifts-based liberalism. It starts with a different core conviction. I am a receiver of gifts. I am a part of a long procession of humanity, that I have received many gifts from those who've came before me, including the gifts of life itself. The essential activity of life is not the pursuit of individual happiness. The essential activity of life is to realize the gifts I've been given by my ancestors and to pass them along, sustainably improved to those who will come after me. Gifts-based liberalism, like autonomy-based liberalism, savor individual choice, but our individual choice takes place within the framework of the gifts we have received and the responsibility to others that those gifts entail. This understanding of choice, I should note, steers the gift-based liberalism or liberal way from both polls in American abortion debate, endorsing neither the pure abortion right stance rooted in bodily autonomy, nor a blanket ban that ignores individual circumstances and pays no heed to social circumstances and pays no heed to social consensus. In our lives, we are citizens and family members. Not just individuals and property owners, not just individuals. We have obligations to our neighbors as well as to those who will come after us. Many of those obligations turn out to be the sources of our greatest joy. A healthy society builds arrangements and passes laws that make it easier to fulfill the obligations that come with our gifts. A diseased society passes laws that make it easier to abandon them. I'm going to try to convince you that gifts-based liberalism is better than autonomy-based liberalism. That it rests on a more accurate set of assumptions about what human life is actually like, and that it leads to humane modes of living and healthier societies. Let me start with four truths that gifts-based liberalism embraces the autonomy-based liberalism subverts. If you don't create your life. From the moment of your birth, life was given to you, not earned. You came out of bursting with the gift of being alive. As you aged, your community taught you to celebrate the prodigality, meaning, prodigality of life, the birds in their thousands of varieties, the deliciousness of different cheeses, the delightful miracle of each human face. Something within us makes us desperately yearn for a longer life, for our friends and loved ones, because life itself is an intrinsic good. The celebration of life's sacredness is so deeply woven into our minds and so central to our civilization that we don't think about it much until confronted with shocking examples of when the celebration is rejected. For example, in early 2000s, a German man named Armin Mewis put an ad online inquiring whether anybody would like to be killed and eaten. A man came by and gave his consent. First, Meows cut off this man's penis, and then two men attempted to eat it together. Then Mewis killed and butchered him. By the time of his arrest, he had consumed more than 40 pounds of flesh. Everything was done with the full consent of both participants. But the extreme nature of the case forced the German court system not only to sentence Mewis to life in prison, but to face an unappreciated yet core pillar of our civilization. You don't have the right to insult life itself. You don't have a right to turn yourself or other people into objects to be carved up and consumed. Life is sacred. Humanity is a higher value than choice. You don't create your dignity. No insignificant person has ever been born, and no insignificant day has ever been lived. Each of us has infinite dignity merely by being alive. We can do nothing to add to that basic dignity. Getting into Harvard doesn't make you more important than others, nor does earning billions of dollars. At the level of our intrinsic dignity, all humans are radically equal. The equal dignity of all life is, for instance, the pillar of the civil rights movement. Suddenly, people who are ill or infirm are implicitly encouraged to feel guilty for wanting to live. Once made administrators began making decisions about the life or death of each applicant based on the quality of their life, they introduced a mode of thinking that suggests that some lives can be more readily extinguished than others, that some lives have more or less than others. A human being who is enfeebled, disabled, depressed, dwindling in their capacities is not created or is not treated the same way as someone who is a healthier and happier. When such a shift occurs, human dignity is no longer regarded as an infinite gift. It is a possession that other humans can appraise and in some cases erase. Once the equal and infinite dignity of all human life is compromised, everything is up for grabs. Suddenly debates arise over which lives are worth living. Suddenly you have a couple of doctors at the Quebec College of Physicians pushing to envelop even further suggesting that babies with severe deformations and limited chances of survival are eligible for medically assisted death. Suddenly, people are ill or infirm are implicitly encouraged to feel guilty for wanting to live. Human dignity, once inherent in life itself, is measured by what a person can contribute, what level of happiness she has deemed capable of enjoying, how much she costs. You don't control your mind. From the earliest beginning, Francis Fukuyama writes, modern liberalism was strongly associated with a distinctive cognitive mode, that of modern natural science and liberal societies. People are supposed to collect data, weigh costs and benefits, and make decisions rationally. Autonomy-based liberalism, with its glorification of individual choice, leans heavily on the conception of human nature. Gifts-based liberals know that no purely rational thinker has ever existed. They know that no one has ever really thought for themselves. And the very language you think with has handed down as a gift from those who came before. We are each nodes in a network through which information flows and is refractured. The information that is stored in our genes comes from eons ago. The information that we call religion and civilization comes from thousands of years ago. This information that we call culture from distant generations. The information that we call education or family background comes from decades ago. All of it flows through us in deep rivers that are partially conscious and partially unconscious, forming our assumptions and shaping our choices in ways that we as individuals often can't fathom. Gifts-based liberals understand how independent human thinking is. When one kid in a high school dies by suicide, that sometimes sets off a contagion, and other kids in that school take their own life. Simply when a nation normalizes medically assisted suicide, it makes it more acceptable option. Then more people may choose suicide. In 2022, in a journal of ethics and mental health found that in 4 jurisdictions, Switzerland, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Belgium, where assisted dying is legal, there have been very steep rises in suicide, including both assisted and unassisted. The physician who assists one person to die by the influencing not just that suicide, but the choice of people he will never see. Gifts-based liberals understand the limitations of individual reason and have a deep awareness of human fallibility. The gifts-based liberals treasure having so many diverse points of view that as individuals, we are usually wrong to some degree, and often to the very large degree. We need to think together over time in order to stumble toward the truth. Intellectual autonomy is a dangerous exaggeration. Gifts-based liberals understand that many times in life, we're not just thinking straight, especially when we are sick, in pain, anxious, or depressed. My friend, the Washington Post columnist Mike Gerson, who died of cancer last year, once said, "Depression is a malfunction of the instrument we use to determine reality." When he was depressed, lying voices took up residence there, spewing out falsehoods. He could scarcely see around. You have a burden to your friends. You have no future. No one would miss you if you died. This is not an autonomous, rational mind. This is a mind that has gone to war with its host. In these extreme cases, human fallibility is not just foolish, it is potentially fatal. To cope with those cases, societies in a gifts-based world erect guardrails, usually instained in law. In effect, the community is saying no suicide is out of bounds, but it's not for if you decide. You don't have the freedom to end your freedom. You don't have the right to make a choice you will never be able to revisit. Banish the question from your mind because the answer is simple. No, individual autonomy is not our ultimate value. Life and belonging are. We are responsible for one another. You did not create your deepest bonds. Liberal institutions are healthiest when they are built on arrangements that precede choice. You didn't choose the family you were born into, the ethnic heritage you were born into, the culture you were born into, the nation you were born into. As you age, you have more choices over how you engage with these things, and many people forge chosen families to supplement their biological ones. But you never fully escape the way these unchosen bonds have formed, and you remain defined through life by no obligations they impose upon you. Autonomy-based liberals see society as a series of social contracts, arrangements people make for their mutual benefit, but a mother's love for her infant daughter is not a contract. Gifts-based liberals see society as resting on a bedrock of covenants. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks once captured the difference this way: a contract is a transaction. This covenant is a relationship. Or to put it slightly different, a contract is about interests. A covenant is about identity. It is about you and me coming together to form an us. A society constructed on gifts-based liberalism does everything it can. Oh, my leg is going to sleep. Oh, much better. Does everything it can